The following program contains coarse language and images that may disturb some viewers.
Melbourne City has won its first A-League Grand Final with a 3-1 victory over a 10-man Sydney FC in Melbourne.
On Australian soccer's biggest stage, a brand new champion was crowned this year. Melbourne City's inaugural A-League victory was a triumph for loyal fans, but also its big spending foreign owner based in Abu Dhabi.
This is a decades-long play to build a global football empire. They want to be global players in a global economy, and using football in this case is one way that they're doing that.
Australian soccer has long operated in the shadows of this country's more established football codes, while tens of millions of dollars have poured into the local game from offshore.
There's been zero media scrutiny of the involvement of most of the people involved in our game, and I think that's the way they like it. If people don't ask questions, they don't need to give answers. It's as simple as that.
In the stadiums, fans focus on the exploits of their teams, not their wealthy owners.
Do you really want to be run by a government that's committing war crimes and part of whose purpose of owning the club is to deflect attention from those war crimes or other human rights abuses? You know, I would argue no. Clubs should be run in the interests of their supporters and their communities, not in the political interests of foreign governments.
No one in Australia had really raised the question of whether we wanted a sporting club in Australia to be owned by a conglomerate in a country that was a little bit shady.
Football clubs have been used internationally for money laundering, for organised criminals to get involved, and from a law enforcement perspective, that's something we would never want to see here in Australia.
More than its domestic rivals like AFL or rugby league, soccer is a truly global game. And with that has come significant levels of foreign investment. Tonight on Four Corners, we look beyond what happens on the field to investigate the cashed-up power brokers behind some of Australia's biggest teams. On a Sunday afternoon in late June, thousands of Australian soccer fans converged on a Melbourne stadium for the code's biggest match of the year. The grand final clash featured two of the league's biggest names, Sydney FC and Melbourne City.
Everywhere we go, it's City boys making all that noise. Everywhere we go, everywhere we go, everywhere we go, it's City boys making all that noise.
With a home ground advantage and the chance to win their first championship, Melbourne City fans were pumped up and out in force.
They're coming, everyone get down! Everyone get down! Grand final day! Let's go! Alright, we're gonna go nice and slow and then go fucking mental, alright? Nice and slow. Sha la 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 la. Shh. Oh, Melbourne boys. Shh. Sha la 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 la. Oh, Melbourne boys, let's go! Sha la 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 la. Oh, Melbourne boys. Sha la 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 la. Oh, Melbourne boys, let's go!
The lead-up was tense because we were missing a lot of our key players with being on Socceroos duty. And so I was nervous, you know, coming into the grand final. Sydney's been the team to beat for years.
At the final whistle, Melbourne City was crowned this year's champion of the men's domestic competition, known as the A-League.
As a fan, that's the best thing you can possibly ask for. I mean, you wait years. I mean, I've been going to games since I was 15 years old, and you dream of winning a championship.
Scott
Jamieson.
Melbourne City's goal-scoring captain Scott Jamieson was credited with a big role in the win. But in his victory speech, Jamieson was quick to single out a much less recognisable club figure.
Firstly, I'd like to thank Melbourne City owner, His Highness Sheikh Mansour.
Melbourne City's owner is the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan. He wasn't at the game. If he was watching at all, it was likely from his home over 11,000 kilometres away in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the UAE.
Sheikh Mansour is, well, he's the Deputy Prime Minister of the UAE. He's an Al Nahyan, which is the ruling family of Abu Dhabi. So he's incredibly powerful on one level.
Sheikh Mansour is also staggeringly rich, with a personal fortune estimated at more than $20 billion. Mansour sits at the apex of the royal family that rules Abu Dhabi, the wealthiest of 7 principalities that form the United Arab Emirates.
He's the brother of the de facto leader of the United Arab Emirates, which is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. And it's his relationship to him from where he gathers most of his power. The Crown Prince is essentially a dictator at this point. He has assumed a lot of power in Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates. And Mansour is very close to him and is part of the inner circle.
Sheikh Mansour's first foray into the soccer world was in 2008, when he bought the then mid-tier English Premier League club Manchester City.
The Sheikh's purchase of Manchester City polarised fans. On the one hand, Manchester City fans loved it because he brought in the money that allowed them to buy all the players and the expertise and the transformation of the club that would buy them success and trophies. But they didn't know who he was. None of us had ever heard of Sheikh Mansour. We didn't know what he was and what he stood for, whether he was really a football fan. There's scepticism over that, of course, given that he's only visited once in 13 years of ownership. And then, of course, there are people questioning his wider motives. What was he in it for the football, or was he in it for other things like, post-oil diversification of a nation's assets, or sports washing, or some other motivation?
Even though Mansour was the Deputy Prime Minister of the UAE, he was often just represented in the press, and particularly by Manchester City, as just a wealthy benefactor, just another sheikh from the Middle East. The level of his involvement to the government and his links to the government were downplayed and underplayed, so nobody really talked about anything other than the fact he had money.
Sheikh Mansour's sports investment company is called City Football Group, a global behemoth recently valued at more than $6 billion.
So City Football Group has been operational since 2013, and it began as a parent company, effectively, of Manchester City and quite soon after New York City FC in New York, and has now grown at this point in 2021 to be a group of the umbrella organisation that owns and has major shareholdings in 10 different football clubs around the world at this point.
In 2014, Sheikh Mansour's City Football Group snapped up a struggling Australian A-League club called Melbourne Heart for about $11 million. Club supporter Harrison Verco remembers how it divided the fan base.
I mean, on one hand, you've got this huge superpower in world football taking over your club. And you know there's going to be a cash injection, and automatically when you hear cash injection, you think that's going to equate to success straight away. And on the other hand, you're seeing this club that you've grown up following and supporting week in and week out be stripped of its identity. And that's hard as a fan. We lost our colours, we lost our name, we lost the badge.
Melbourne Heart was renamed Melbourne City, and its colours were changed from red and white to light blue. Why would the City Football Group, which owns huge teams like Manchester City, be interested in buying a much smaller team in a much smaller market like Melbourne City?
One of the reasons would be around identifying young talent, both men and women. And because they have a network around the world in which they can move those players, it allows them to identify young talent, sell them on to other clubs and further their development as well as realise some commercial gain.
The team also became a part of what critics say is a slick propaganda machine, designed to burnish the UAE's international image. Melbourne City is one of several city football teams being used by the UAE to promote next month's World Expo in Dubai.
The UAE seeks to promote their brand as one of glamour, one of positivity, one of wealth, and certainly one of being very globally connected. The reality in our view is that much of that actually diverts and distracts from the significant and concerning human rights abuses that are happening in the UAE on a daily basis.
Amnesty International has consistently criticised the United Arab Emirates' record on human rights.
Amnesty have many concerns around human rights violations occurring in the UAE. Some of those include the silencing and imprisonment of those speaking out in opposition to the ruling family. Certainly the rights of women are a concern for us, the rights of same-sex couples, and there are disturbing human rights violations within the kafala, which is the system of sponsorship for migrant workers.
If a picture speaks 1,000 words, then the video you're about to see, uncovered in an exclusive Nightline investigation, tells a long and dark story. A member of a royal family abusing his power in a violent and despicable way.
Sheikh Mansour's family has been implicated in shocking human rights abuses. A video leaked to the US media showed his brother, Sheikh Issa, torturing a merchant in the desert over a business dispute involving $5,000 worth of grain.
With the help of a man in a police uniform, the victim has his legs tied and then is forced to the ground, held down by the officer, as sand is shoved into the victim's mouth by what the UAE government now acknowledges to ABC News is one of the country's 22 royal sheikhs. Sheikh Issa, the brother of the Crown Prince. After using a cattle prod on his victim, there's this gruesome scene. The sheikh points to a board with a nail protruding and then begins to beat him again and again. The tape ends with what appears to be attempted murder. The victim is left semi-conscious as Sheikh Issa drives over him back and forth with his Mercedes SUV.
After the tape emerged, Sheikh Issa was put on trial.
Ultimately, a UAE court cleared him of any wrongdoing, and it became clear for everyone who followed it that this was a state that had members of its royal family who were involved in deeply disturbing acts and for whom the rule of law simply didn't apply.
Nicholas McGeehan has been researching human rights abuses for nearly 20 years. His work for Human Rights Watch led to him being blacklisted by the United Arab Emirates.
It's dangerous to rank countries in terms of their human rights records, and it's a difficult thing to do because all states violate human rights to some extent. But if there was a ranking, the UAE would be somewhere down the bottom. They have an appalling human rights record.
In the world's most famous sporting city, together we laid the foundations.
Human rights activists believe the UAE uses its ownership of clubs like Manchester City and Melbourne City to launder its reputation.
People associate sport with positivity, with achievement, with prowess and athleticism, and this can be used in what we call sports washing. And sport washing essentially is taking that positive attribute that's associated with sport and using it to improve your reputation. So essentially that can be leveraging off the glamour, the access, the universal appeal of sport to improve your brand, and it can also be seen to disguise or divert away from human rights violations.
If you're involved in war crimes in Yemen, if you're disappearing people in Abu Dhabi, if you're rendering Saudi women's rights activists back to Riyadh where they are tortured, it helps to have a football club to put your name in positive terms in the press.
Amnesty International believes City Football Group shouldn't own an Australian team due to the UAE's poor human rights record.
Amnesty International in Australia is not in support of a City Group investment in Melbourne City. We feel alarmed and concerned around the potential for that to distract from the significant human rights abuses occurring in the UAE.
Melbourne City's most senior directors occupy powerful political posts in the United Arab Emirates. The club's chairman is Khaldoon Al Mubarak, a senior advisor to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. Its vice chairman is English-born PR consultant Simon Pearce. Based in Sydney, he's also a special advisor to the Abu Dhabi government.
Pearce is hugely significant in Abu Dhabi. For a start, he's been there for I think at least 2006. He was a PR executive at Burson Marsteller and went to work for the Abu Dhabi Executive Affairs Authority. Has been instrumental in government policy there for a long time, principally communications though, that's his key role. I think probably the simplest way to think of him is he's the Minister of Propaganda for the United Arab Emirates.
It's not possible to separate Simon Pearce's role as advisor, key advisor to the most important political figures in UAE, and his figure within City Football Group, because they are obviously linked. They go hand in hand. The football, CFG, the football entity, are part of the public face of the UAE. So yes, you can't separate the roles. It's a very important role. It's the most public thing that the UAE do that's positive.
Simon Pearce is one of the most powerful figures in Australian and international soccer.
There is no person that works harder. There is no person in football that has got more integrity. He has been an enormous benefit to the game here. Look, Simon is also a director of all the City Football Group clubs, so his influence in the world game is very significant, and his ability to bring different views to the table was quite frankly outstanding. In 2019, Simon Pearce was embroiled in an international scandal when Manchester City was investigated by European soccer's governing body, UEFA, over rorting its club funding rules, known as financial fair play.
Financial fair play was set up by UEFA to stop financial doping, to keep clubs sustainable. So basically saying you can't come in and artificially pump money into football clubs and buy success that way, because that will lead to boom and bust and clubs going out of business.
The Premier League champions are under investigation by UEFA after documents were leaked apparently showing they'd used sponsorship deals to get around the regulations.
The principal allegation against Manchester City was that they had been receiving enormous amounts of disguised investment. In other words, that their sponsorship deals with entities like Etihad Airways were not in fact being funded by Etihad, but by other entities in the UAE.
A leaked email to Simon Pearce referred to £67.5 million owing to Manchester City from its sponsor, Etihad Airways. The email suggested only £8 million of that was to be funded directly by Etihad, while the rest, £59.5 million, was to be secretly paid by Sheikh Mansour's company, the Abu Dhabi United Group.
The accusation was that the state had reimbursed these entities, so they were effectively putting money in themselves and hiding this as sponsorship money.
UEFA launched an investigation.
We are waiting for news of any possible punishment.
City refused to cooperate, in effect. They just point blank refused. City Football Group treated UEFA's investigation with utter disdain.
We have huge breaking news here. Manchester City are to be punished for breaking financial rules in football, and they have been banned from all UEFA competition for the 2 seasons after this one.
UEFA banned Manchester City from its competition for 2 years and fined it €30 million. Manchester City appealed and had the ban overturned because a court found there was insufficient evidence. Simon Pearce was cleared of wrongdoing, but the court fined Manchester City €10 million for not cooperating with UEFA's original investigation.
A €10 million fine for not cooperating is quite a statement. It's in the top 5 fines ever handed out in the world in relation to football wrongdoing.
Foreign money has flowed into Australian soccer since the inception of the A-League competition 16 years ago. Today, 5 of the 12 teams are foreign-owned or controlled. But all too often, the financing behind the clubs has been obscured because there's no requirement to publicly disclose it.
I think generally speaking in football around the world, there's a greater need for transparency and accountability. We don't have the same level of insight into the ownership of the clubs that they do in other countries. And it's a basic tenet of good governance that we have some transparency and accountability around ownership, both foreign-owned and Australian-owned.
Bonita Merciades is a former corporate affairs executive with soccer's regulatory body, Football Australia. She blew the whistle on alleged corruption in the 2022 Soccer World Cup bidding process and has been pressing for more transparency in the game ever since.
They're private entities operating in a sport, and sport has a level of transparency and accountability. We demand a level of transparency and accountability from sport because it is something that we all engage with, and it is something that we should be aware of who are the owners, how they're financed, how they're structured, and why they're here and what they're getting out of it.
City trailed in the first half but were deserved winners, ending Sydney's dream of an historic 3rd consecutive title.
The team Melbourne City beat in this year's grand final is also foreign-owned. Sydney FC has become one of the A-League's dominant clubs. Its owner is a Russian tycoon, David Traktovenko, who's worth an estimated $250 million.
David Traktovenko is a Russian businessman with multiple business interests. He's a well-known developer, and he's also known as the owner of the Sydney Football Club.
David Traktovenko made his fortune in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, when he was a large shareholder in a commercial bank called Promstroy Bank. Among its powerful shareholders was future President Vladimir Putin, who also held an account there. Traktovenko's business partner was Vladimir Kogan, who was nicknamed Putin's banker. Kogan reportedly bragged about using the KGB to protect the bank at a time when predatory organised crime gangs were flourishing in St. Petersburg.
It seems pretty clear that the protection that Promstroy Bank found was with the state security structures, with the structures of the former KGB. Kogan was famous for declaring that the best protection, the best roof in Russian Argot was the KGB.
In 2005, Traktovenko bought 15% of Sydney FC, later increasing it to a controlling stake.
Traktovenko got involved in buying Sydney FC because he has a daughter who lives in Sydney. She is married to an Australian. He has Australian grandchildren, and he already has an interest in football. So when Sydney FC was being formed and there was an opportunity to invest in it, he did so. It's fair to say that since he has been the majority shareholder of Sydney FC has lived up to its big name brand reputation as being one of the best and biggest clubs in Australia. They've invested in facilities and infrastructure, and they've had enormous success on and off the field.
David's a charming person, used to own Zenit St. Petersburg in Russia, which was a team that competed at the highest level of the European Champions League. He comes to the matches. His daughter Elena is married to Scott Barlow, the chairman. They have assimilated brilliantly into Australian society, very decent people, and the fact he has invested so far in this game over $50 million and has produced an extraordinarily successful football club in the Australian system. And I think if people have an issue with him, they've had, I think, probably 10 or 12 years to have raised that with him, and no one has, as I've seen it.
Adelaide lawyer Greg Griffin knows the challenges of owning an Australian soccer club. For 7 years, he co-owned Adelaide United with a local businessman.
Unless you have a very wealthy owner who is prepared to basically fund losses, most of the Australian clubs have found it very difficult, and many have fallen by the wayside.
In 2018, Griffin and his partners sold Adelaide United to a consortium of Dutch investors. The new owners insisted on remaining anonymous.
The only person that I knew in the consortium, or the front person, was Piet van der Pol, who had been a player agent for one of our players. So I'd met him once or twice, and basically he said he represented he's Dutch, resident in China, and he said he represented a consortium out of Holland, and that's as much information as we were ever given. It's clearly not ideal, and I think it's probably unheard of in most European leagues where ownerships are very transparent.
Even today, the Dutch investors who own Adelaide United refuse to disclose their identities.
I think any entity wanting to come into the A-League should disclose precisely who they are and what they are. I think the fans of each individual club are entitled to know that. So look, I simply don't know why the situation has arisen and why the Dutch consortium are so loath to have themselves disclosed, their identities disclosed. But if they're not obliged to, they don't have to under the current rules. So they've done nothing wrong.
Exactly how much money foreign owners have poured into the game isn't publicly available. Most Australian soccer clubs are run as private companies that are not required to publish financial statements. Why does it matter where money comes from?
It matters because in sport, as in life, transparency and accountability matter. And therefore, if we hold those things to be important, they are important in sport.
It's a very small market here in Australia, so if you can attract foreign investment, that can potentially be a great thing because it opens a whole pool of money that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. But that also means that there's a level of opaqueness or lack of transparency so that we can't necessarily see who those international conglomerates or investors are.
Sports integrity researcher Catherine Ordway believes more transparency is vital to ensure the game remains clean.
From an integrity perspective, it's concerning because we have seen a number of international reports that have said that football clubs have been used internationally for money laundering, for organised criminals to get involved, and from a law enforcement perspective, that's something we would never want to see here in Australia.
The Roar found their mojo and scored through substitute Alex Parsons in the first 10 minutes.
Brisbane Roar is a powerhouse of the A-League, with 3 championships to its name. But in 2011, it was in financial dire straits. Its saviour was one of Indonesia's largest corporations, the Bakri Group.
The Bakri Group from Indonesia has strong interests in mining, banking and agriculture. It now has controlling interests in football clubs in Asia, Europe, South America and Australia.
You know, we don't see this as a one-off. I think ultimately a blend of Australian ownership and international and foreign ownership is really good for the league.
I think the approach by the Bakri Group would have elicited a sigh of relief in A-League circles. Look, we've got a suitor. You know, it's almost like you've got a kid who's like the black sheep of the family, and nobody wants to, you know, support it. All of a sudden, here comes this fabulous suitor. So it's almost like a marriage of convenience, I guess. Maybe they were a little bit reluctant to dig too deeply into the background of the Bakri Group.
I think the reaction amongst the supporter group was a little bit twofold. Like, I think there was this initial relief that, you know, there was going to be some money injected and things might go the way that they should be going, and that the financial support would mean growth and improvement and things like that. But I also think, again, there was this kind of slight trepidation about what being, you know, having the club fully owned by an overseas entity might mean.
After making an initial investment in 2011, the Bakri Group became the sole owner the following year.
All of the coverage was about how this would be the first time a professional sporting organisation in Australia would be owned 100% by a foreign entity. Was spoken of in incredibly glowing terms, and all of the news was about how this would be good for football. You know, that the Brisbane Roar would have an academy, they'd be bankrolled by, you know, this wealthy Indonesian conglomerate.
Indonesian-born academic Nasir Barfin was working as a radio producer at the time.
I followed football heavily. My background's Indonesian, so I was born in Jakarta, and I guess I also kept an eye on the business side of things, because I did used to be a business reporter in Singapore. And so I thought this might be an interesting story to cover, because no one in Australia had really raised the question of whether we wanted a sporting club in Australia to be owned by a conglomerate in a country that was a little bit, that was a little bit shady.
The Bakri family patriarch is Abu Rizal Bakri. Bakri is a former minister in the Indonesian government and former chairman of Indonesia's notorious Golkar political party.
Indonesian political parties are uniformly corrupt, and Golkar is probably the worst of them, widely seen as the worst of them.
It's the political party of the former authoritarian leader Suharto, and Suharto himself was ranked one of the most corrupt leaders in the world by Transparency International during his tenure in office.
In 2006, a Bakri Group company was accused of causing one of Indonesia's worst ever environmental disasters.
The mud spill has displaced more than 10,000 people in East Java. Environmentalists are blaming oil drilling by Lapindo Brantas, a company that's majority owned by billionaire government minister Abu Rizal Bakri.
The eruption of the so-called mud volcano was blamed on the company drilling nearby. The Bakri Group denied responsibility and was eventually cleared by an Indonesian court, but it was forced by the government to pay compensation.
So the Bakri Group did actually compensate the farmers whose livelihoods were affected. The compensation was an absolutely paltry amount. A lot of them did have to go into look into other sources of income, you know, to feed those families.
When the Bakri Group bought Brisbane Roar, the deal was done by Abu Rizal Bakri's younger brother, Nurwan. He's a powerful figure in Indonesian football.
Nurwan was the deputy chairman of the Indonesian Football Association, the sort of the second in command, beneath another prominent member of Golkar, Nurdin Halid, for an extended period in the 2000s. And he's had a strong interest not only as an administrator within Indonesia's football association, but also as an individual who runs football clubs, right? So he has interest in the clubs at the same time.
Company documents show the Bakris own Brisbane Roar through an Indonesian holding company. A senior director of that company is a man named Joko Driono. Driono is a former head of the Indonesian Football Association, who was jailed in 2019 for tampering with evidence in a police match-fixing inquiry.
In order to crack down on the rampant match fixing and corruption within Indonesian football, the police assembled a task force, which was an anti-mafia task force. And Joko Driono was one of the major scalps of that anti-mafia task force.
Driono was jailed for 18 months after being convicted of directing an associate to remove evidence during the police investigation. We've discovered that he is in fact still listed as a senior director of the holding company that owns the Brisbane Roar. How surprising is that to you?
Not surprising at all. I don't think we should assume that legal trouble is any barrier to political office, to advancement in big business, to advancement in the Indonesian bureaucracy.
Is this something that Football Australia should A, be aware of, and B, be concerned about?
They should certainly be aware of it. They should be concerned about it.
3 years into the Bakri's ownership of Brisbane Roar, the club was in financial crisis and facing legal action. Players weren't being paid, and the A-League threatened to tear up the Bakri Group's licence. The Bakris managed to hold on, but it damaged their reputation with the fans.
I think when you're trying to build the culture of something like a football club, that's really damaging, not just to the people on the inside who probably know a lot more than we do on the outside, but also to the people on the outside. You know, you're asking us to trust you, to buy into your kind of membership, but we don't know whether people are getting paid or bills are getting paid, so it's a really fraught thing.
Neither the football clubs nor the governing body would appear in this program. In a statement, Football Australia said it works closely with law enforcement agencies to protect and preserve financial integrity in the game. It says it applies a fit and proper test to clubs, which must provide independently audited financial accounts each year.
I think it goes without saying that there needs to be good governance in football, and key to that is transparency and accountability. But that applies whether it's a foreign-owned club or an Australian-owned club. And so the question we really need to ask is there sufficient due diligence, is there sufficient transparency and accountability around any club that's coming into the A-League?
Australian football is entering a new era that hands the private clubs even more power. They now have the right to run their competition after breaking away from the regulator Football Australia last year.
The new model is that the A-League clubs have management and operational control over their competition. They can make decisions about their competition, which of course impacts the level of their investment and how they go about doing their business. The Football Association continues to have what is called a good of game controlling interest, and they have, importantly, they have and maintain the stewardship of community football and of national teams and player development and those sorts of things.
The clubs had a very different agenda and a very different idea of how the A-League had to progress and grow, and did not wish to be living under the coattails of the FFA and the board.
To run the game, the club owners have formed a new private company called Australian Professional Leagues, delivering the foreign owners of Brisbane Roar, Sydney FC and Melbourne City unprecedented influence.
When you actually look at the meaning of the word club and what it should actually mean, what all these great sports clubs started out as, these are social institutions of great importance to the people that support them, to the communities where they reside. These, yes, might now be owned by, oligarchs and billionaires, but essentially the people at the heart of any sports club are its fans and the communities where those clubs reside.
I think we expect a lot more from companies nowadays than we used to. Like even 10 years ago, we didn't expect the same level of social responsibility or environmental responsibility that we do now. And I don't think owning a football team makes you immune from those pressures. In fact, I think it probably increases them in a lot of ways, because you have the livelihood of so many prominent people and well-respected people and, heroes and idols for young kids on your payroll, that you should be held to those same levels of moral and ethical, environmental, social standards that we're holding other companies to.